Avadim, Chapter 1, Introduction to Hilchos Avadim. They contain 13 mitzvahs, 5 positive mitzvahs, and 8 negative mitzvahs. They are 1. The laws governing the acquisition of a Hebrew servant. 2. Not to sell him in the manner that servants are usually sold. 3. Not to make him perform excruciating labor. 4. Not to make him perform servile tasks. 5. Not to allow a resident alien to make him perform excruciating labor. 6. To grant a Hebrew servant a severance gift when he attains his freedom. 7. Not to let him go free empty-handed. 8. To redeem a Hebrew maidservant. 9. To designate her as a wife. 10. Not to sell her a second time. 11. To have a Canaanite servant work forever, unless his master causes one of his primary limbs to fall. 12. Not to return to his master a servant who fled from the diaspora to Eretz Yisrael. 13. Not to oppress the servant who has fled to us. These mitzvahs are explained in the chapters that follow. 1. The term Hebrew servant used by the Torah refers to a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion, or a person who sells himself willingly. What is implied? When a person steals and does not have the resources to repay the principal, the court sells him, as we have explained in Hilchos Geneva. No other Jewish person is sold by the court except a thief. Concerning such a thief, sold by the court, Exodus 21:2 states, when you acquire a Hebrew servant. And concerning this person, Deuteronomy 15:12 states, when your Jewish brother will be sold to you. To what does the term a person who sells himself refer? When a Jew becomes sorely impoverished, the Torah gives him permission to sell himself as a servant. As Leviticus 25:39 states, when your brother will become impoverished and be sold to you. A person is not allowed to sell himself as a servant and stash away the money, use it to buy merchandise or utensils, or give it to his creditor. He may sell himself only when he needs the money for his very livelihood. A person is not permitted to sell himself unless he has no property remaining at all, i.e., even as clothing no longer remains. Only in such a situation may he sell himself too. We have already explained that a woman is never sold because of a theft. Similarly, she may not sell herself as a servant, nor may she purchase a Hebrew servant or a Canaanite slave because of the suspicion of immoral behavior. A convert may not be purchased as a Hebrew servant. This is derived from Leviticus 25:41, and he shall return to his family, i.e., it is speaking about someone who has a family within the Jewish faith. 3. A Hebrew servant who is sold by the court is sold only to a native-born Israelite or to a convert to Judaism. Similarly, a person who sells himself as a servant is not permitted to sell himself to a Gentile, not even to a resident alien. If he transgresses and sells himself even to a Gentile, even to the service of a false divinity itself, the sale is binding, as indicated by Leviticus 25:47, which speaks of a person selling himself to what must be uprooted from a sojourner's family. What must be uprooted refers to a false divinity. 4. If a person says, I'm going to sell myself to a Gentile, you are not obligated to do anything for him until he actually sells himself. Once he sells himself to a Gentile, however, although he transgressed and acted improperly, it is a mitzvah to redeem him so that he does not assimilate among them. As Leviticus 25:48 states, after he is sold, redemption should be granted him. 5. Neither a person who sells himself nor one who is sold by the court should be sold in public on an auction block, nor in an alley as slaves are sold. As Leviticus 25:42 states, he shall not be sold as a slave is sold. Instead, he should be sold in a private and honorable manner. 6. It is forbidden to make any Hebrew servant perform excruciating labor. What is excruciating labor? Labor that is no limit, or labor that is unnecessary and is asked of a servant with the intent to give him work so that he will not remain idle. Based on the above, our sages said that a master should not tell a Hebrew servant, hoe under the vines until I come, for he has not placed a limit on the work asked of him. Instead, he should tell him, hoe until this and this time, or until you reach this and this place. Similarly, he should not tell him, dig in this place, if he has no need for that activity. Even telling him to warm a drink for him or to cool one off for him if he does not need it is forbidden, and reflects the violation of a negative commandment, as Leviticus 25:43 states, do not impose excruciating work on him. Thus, a Hebrew servant may be compelled to perform only a limited and necessary task. Similarly, if a Hebrew servant is sold to a Gentile who imposes excruciating labor upon him, the Jews are commanded to prevent him from doing so. If they allow him to continue, they transgress a negative commandment, as Ibid 53. You should not impose excruciating work upon him before your eyes. We are not, however, required to enter the Gentile's domain and check to see that he is not imposing excruciating labor upon him. This is implied by the term before your eyes, i.e., when you see. 7. Whenever a Jew purchases a Hebrew servant, he may not make him perform debasing tasks that are relegated only for servants. For instance, to have him carry his clothes to the bathhouse or remove his shoes. As Leviticus 25:39 states, do not have him perform servile tasks. Instead, one should treat him as a hired laborer. As Ibid 40 continues, he shall be like a hired laborer or a resident among you. It is, however, permitted to have the servant cut the master's hair, launder his clothes, and bake his dough. He may not, however, make him the manager of a public bathhouse, a public barber, or a public baker. If, however, this was his profession before he was sold, it is permitted. Indeed, at the outset, he should not teach him any profession at all. Instead, he should work at the profession at which he worked previously. When does the above apply? To a Hebrew servant. For his self-image is depressed because of his being sold. When, however, a Jew has not been sold, he may be hired to perform servile tasks, for he is performing this work out of his own desire and his own consent. 8. When people do not conduct themselves in an appropriate manner, it is permissible to impose one authority over them by force and subjugate them. When a king decrees that anyone who does not pay the fixed head tax should be enslaved to the person who pays the head tax for him, a person who pays the head tax for someone may use that person for labor beyond the ordinary measure. He may not, however, use him as a Canaanite slave. If, however, that person does not conduct himself properly, he may use him as a slave. 9. A master is obligated to treat any Hebrew servant or maidservant as his equal with regard to food, drink, clothing, and living quarters, as implied by Deuteronomy 15:16, for it is good for him with you. The master should not eat bread made from fine flour while the servant eats bread from coarse flour. The master should not drink aged wine while the servant drinks fresh wine. The master should not sleep on cushions while the servant sleeps on straw. Nor should the master live in a walled city while the servant lives in a village, or the master live in a village while the servant lives in a walled city, as implied by Leviticus 25:41, and he shall leave you. On this basis, our sages said, whoever purchases a Hebrew servant purchases a master for himself. A master must treat his servants with brotherly love, as implied by Leviticus 25:46, and with regard to your brothers, the children of Israel. Nevertheless, the servant must conduct himself as a servant with regard to those tasks he must perform. 10. The institution of a Hebrew maidservant and that of a Hebrew servant is not practiced except in the time when the Jubilee year is observed. This applies both to a Hebrew servant himself, who sells himself, and to one who was sold by the court. We have already explained when the observance of the Jubilee year was nullified. Chapter 2. 1. A Hebrew servant who is sold by the court and one who sells himself can be acquired through the transfer of money or articles worth money or the transfer of a deed of sale. What is implied? The person selling himself writes on a paper or a shard, I am sold to you, or I have been acquired by you, and gives him the deed. 2. A servant sold by the court must serve his master for 6 years from the day that he was sold. At the beginning of his 7th year, he is released as a free man. If the sabbatical year falls within his 6 years of servitude, he must work during it. If, however, the Jubilee year falls during this time, even if he was sold only 1 year before the Jubilee, he should be granted his freedom. As Leviticus 25:40 states, until the Jubilee year he shall work for you. And Ibid 13 states, in this Jubilee year each man shall return to his ancestral heritage. 3. A person who sells himself into servitude may sell himself for more than 6 years. Nevertheless, even if he sold himself for 10 years or 20 years, if the Jubilee year falls after he sold himself, he is released in the Jubilee. As it is written, until the Jubilee year he shall work with you. 4. If either a servant who sold himself or who was sold by the court flees his master's domain, he is obligated to complete his 6 years of servitude. If, however, the Jubilee year falls during this time, he is granted his freedom. 5. Should the servant become sick, whether he is sick year after year, or whether he becomes sick repeatedly for short periods, if the time during which he is sick is less than 4 years, it should be counted in the period of 6 years. If, however, he is sick from 4 years or more, he is required to complete work for all the days of his illness beyond the 6 years for which he was originally sold. This is implied by Leviticus 25:40. He shall be hired like a hired laborer or resident among you. If the Jubilee year falls in the midst of the time he is compensating for the missed years, he should be released. When to be calculated the days of sickness? When the sickness is severe and the servant is unable to work. If, however, his sickness is not very severe and he can do little work, the time is counted even if he is sick for the entire 6 years. 6. When a person sells himself to a Gentile, if he is not redeemed, he is not released, except in the Jubilee. As Leviticus 25:54 states, if he is not redeemed by these, he shall be released in the Jubilee, he and his sons together with him. 7. When a person is sold to a Gentile, if he cannot obtain the funds necessary to redeem himself, his relatives should redeem him. The closer the relatives, the greater the responsibility, as implied by Leviticus 25:49. His uncle or his uncle's son shall redeem him. The court compels the relatives to redeem him so that he will not become assimilated among the Gentiles. If his relatives do not redeem him and he does not attain the funds to redeem himself, it is a mitzvah for every Jew to redeem him. Whether he was redeemed by his relative or by any other person, he is released and obtains his freedom. The servant may borrow money to redeem himself from a Gentile, and he may redeem himself partially. When, by contrast, a person is sold to a Jew, his relatives may not redeem him, he may not borrow to redeem himself, and he may not redeem himself partially. What is the law that applies to him? If he obtains the funds to pay the amount due for the years that remain, he may pay that amount and be released. If he does not obtain the full amount, he is not released. 8. Whether a person sells himself to a Jew or a Gentile, or whether he is sold by the court, he may deduct money from the price at which he was sold when redeeming himself and obtain his release. What is implied? A servant who was sold by the court for 60 denarim and worked for 4 of the 6 years. He then obtained resources. He should pay 20 denarim and be granted his freedom. Similarly, if he sold himself for 40 denarim for 10 years, he should deduct 4 denarim for every year. He may give the remainder in money or in objects worth money and obtain his freedom. Similarly, a servant sold to a Gentile should calculate the number of years left until the Jubilee, as Leviticus 25:50 states, and he shall calculate with his master the number of years from the year he was sold until the Jubilee year. What is implied? If the servant sold himself for 100 denarim and 10 years remained until the Jubilee, he should calculate 10 denarim for each year that he worked, deduct this amount from the money that he was paid, and give his owner the remainder in cash, and then he is granted his freedom. He may not give his owner produce or utensils. This is applied by the above verse, which mentions the money of his purchase, i.e., he is redeemed with money from the Gentile, not with articles that are worth money. 9. Whenever a Hebrew servant or maidservant is redeemed by deducting from the price of the sale, the calculation is always made in his or her favor, whether his health improves or his value increases, or his health deteriorates and his value decreases. What is implied? A servant was sold for 100 denarii, but now he is worth 200. We calculate the value of the remaining years on the basis of 100. If he was sold for 200 and is now worth 100, we calculate the value of the remaining years on the basis of 100. 10. When a person is sold to a Gentile, he can redeem himself partially, as stated above. Sometimes this will work to his advantage, and sometimes it will work to his disadvantage. How can it work to his advantage? His master purchases him for 200 zuz. His value decreases, and now he is worth 100. The servant gives his master 50, half of his present worth. He then regains his health and is again worth 200. All he is required to pay is 100, the remaining half of his value. He is then released. How can it work to his disadvantage? His master purchases him for 200 zuz. The servant gave his master half was worth 100 zuz. His value then decreased, and he is now worth 100. To redeem himself, he must pay his master 50 zuz, half the remaining amount. Thus, he paid 150 zuz to redeem himself, even though he is now worth only 100. 11. Although a master forgoes the remaining amount of money for which a servant is obligated to work, this obligation is not considered to be waived until the master writes a bill of release for the servant. What is implied? His master purchased him for 60 zuz. The servant worked for a year or two. Then his master told him, I am willing to waive the work due for the remainder of your money. Go on your way. The servant is not released from his servitude until his master has a legal document composed. 12. The following rules apply when a servant's master dies. If the master is survived by a son, the servant must serve the son until the conclusion of the 6 years, until the conclusion of the years for which he was sold himself, until the Jubilee year, until he deducts the money for the years he worked and pays the remainder. If, however, the master is not survived by a son, the servant is granted his freedom. He need not serve a surviving daughter or the deceased's brother. Needless to say, he need not serve other heirs. When a servant is sold to a convert or a Gentile, he is not required to serve even the master's son. Instead, when his master dies, he obtains his freedom. Thus, a Hebrew servant can be acquired through the transfer of money or a bill of sale, and can acquire his freedom through one of 5 means. A, the conclusion of his years of servitude. B, the advent of the Jubilee year. C, by paying money in amount reduced in consideration of the years he worked. D, through being given a bill of release. And E, through the death of the master without a son, or the master is a Gentile or a convert, even if he is survived by a son. It is a mitzvah to tell a servant, go out, at the time of his release. Nevertheless, even if his master does not tell him this, the servant attains his freedom without any cost. Nor is a bill of release required, even if he had been sick or his master spent much on his medical expenses. The servant has no obligations to the master as imply by Exodus 21:2. He shall go free at no charge. Chapter 3:1. A master is obligated to provide sustenance for the wife of every Hebrew servant. This applies when the marriage has been consummated as nisuin, but not when she is merely in arusa, or she is awaiting her yavam. And this applies only when she is permitted to her husband. If, however, she is forbidden to him by a Torah prohibition, or even if she is a shnia, the master is not required to provide her with sustenance. This is derived from Exodus 21:3, his wife together with him, i.e., a woman who is fit to live together with him. Similarly, the master is liable to provide the servants' sons and daughters with their sustenance. These concepts are derived as follows. With regard to the release of a servant sold by the court, it is written, but if he is married to a woman, his wife will leave together with him. Would you think that because the master purchased the servant's wife would be placed in servitude? Instead, the verse is stated for the sole purpose of teaching that the master is obligated to provide the servant's wife with her sustenance. With regard to the release of the servant who sells himself, Leviticus 25:41 states, and he shall depart from you, he and his children with him. And with regard to the release of a servant sold to a Gentile, it is written in Leviticus 54, and he shall go out in the Jubilee year, he and his children with him. This applies to a wife or children the servant had at the time he was sold, or a wife and children that he acquired after the sale, provided he married with the consent of his master. If, however, the servant married without the consent of his master, the master is not obligated to provide for her sustenance. 2. Although a master is obligated to provide for the sustenance of a servant's wife and children, he is not entitled to the proceeds of their work at all. Instead, the proceeds of the work of the servant's wife and any ownerless objects she finds belong to her husband. Whatever rights the husband has in his relationship with his wife, he retains, although he is a Hebrew servant. 3. When a servant is sold by the court, his master has the option of giving him a Canaanite maidservant as a wife. This applies to the master who purchased him, or the son who becomes his master if the master dies. He may give him a Canaanite maidservant as a wife, and compel him to engage in relations with her, so that she gives birth to slaves that he conceived. She is permitted to him throughout the period of his servitude, as implied by Exodus 21:4, if his master will give him a wife. A person who sells himself as a servant is forbidden to marry a Canaanite slave, as are all other Jews. 4. A Hebrew servant is not permitted to marry a Canaanite maidservant unless he already has a Jewish wife and children. If, however, he does not have a Jewish wife and children, his master may not give him a Canaanite maidservant against his will. This concept is part of the oral tradition. Even if the man sold as a servant is a priest, he is permitted to marry a Canaanite maidservant throughout the duration of his servitude. 5. If a Hebrew servant has a wife and children, although his master may give him a Canaanite maidservant as a wife, he may not separate the Hebrew servant from his Jewish wife and children. This is implied by the phrase, his wife together with him. He may not give him 2 maidservants, nor may he give 1 maidservant to 2 Hebrew servants, as he is allowed to with regard to his Canaanite slaves, as implied by the phrase, give him a wife. When a servant whose master gave him a Canaanite maidservant, and whose ear was pierced, does not desire to leave his master's domain when the Jubilee year arrives, although his master urges him to depart, if his master injures him, his master is not liable. He is permitted to strike him, because at that time the servant becomes prohibited to have relations with a maidservant. 6. A person who sells himself may not prolong his servitude by having his ear pierced. If, however, a servant was sold by the court and worked for 6 years and does not desire to receive his freedom, he may have his ear pierced. In this instance, he must work until the Jubilee year or until his master dies. 7. Even though the master leaves his son, the servant whose ear was pierced does not serve the son. This is derived from the exegesis of Exegesis of Exodus 21:6, and he shall serve him forever. This is interpreted to mean, and he shall serve him, and not a son, forever until the Jubilee year. We thus learn that a servant whose ear was pierced gains his freedom only at the Jubilee or with the death of his master. 8. A Hebrew servant who is a priest may not have his ear pierced, because this gives him a physical blemish that disqualifies him from service in the temple. And Leviticus 25:41 states, and he shall return to his family, to the status that he enjoyed previously. He does not, however, return to the position of authority that he previously held. 9. How is his servant's ear pierced? His master brings him to a court of 3 judges, and the servant makes his statements in their presence. At the conclusion of the 6-year period, he brings him to the door or to the doorpost as they are standing affixed to the building. It could be done near the door or the doorpost of the master or one belonging to any other person. He should pierce his right ear, in the middle lobe of his ear, with a metal awl until it reaches the door. As Deuteronomy 15:7 states, and he shall put it through his ear at the door. The doorpost is mentioned only to indicate that the servant may stand next to either the door or the doorpost. Just as the doorpost must be standing, so too the door must be standing, but the piercing is done to the door. The master himself pierces the servant's ear, as Exodus 21:6 states, his master shall pierce, i.e. he, and not his son, his agent, or the agent of the court. The ears of 2 servants should not be pierced at the same time, for mitzvahs should not be performed in bundles. 10. More particulars can be derived from the exegesis of Exodus 25:5. If the servant shall certainly say, i.e. he must repeat his statement. The servant, he must make this statement as a servant, i.e. he must make and repeat his statement at the conclusion of the 6 years of servitude, at the beginning of the last prutta's worth of his servitude. What is implied? That they remain from the final day at least a prutta's worth or slightly more of the servant's time. If, however, there remains less than a prutta's worth of time, it is as if he made the statement after the 6 years were concluded. 11. If the servant is a Canaanite maidservant, has a wife and children from her, and his master does not have a wife and children, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by Deuteronomy 15:16, because he loves you and your household. If the master has a wife and children, and the servant does not have a wife and children, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by the Exodus 21:5. I love my master, my wife, and my children. If the servant loves his master, but his master does not love him, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by Deuteronomy. It is good for him with you. If the master loves the servant, but the servant does not love the master, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by Deuteronomy. He loves you. If the servant is sick, but his master is not sick, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by it is good for him with you. If the master is sick, but the servant is not sick, or they are both sick, his ear should not be pierced, as implied by it is good for him with you, i.e., they must both share in goodness. 12. What are the differences between a servant who sells himself and a servant sold by the court? A servant who sells himself does not have his ear pierced, while a servant sold by the court has his ear pierced. A servant who sells himself is forbidden to marry a Canaanite maidservant, while the master of a servant sold by the court may compel the servant to marry a Canaanite maidservant. A servant who sells himself may be sold to a Gentile, while a servant sold by the court may be sold only to a Jew, as Deuteronomy 15:12 states, when your brother is sold to you, i.e. the court sells him only to you. A servant who sells himself may be sold for 6 years or for more than 6 years, while a servant sold by the court may be sold for only 6 years. A servant who sells himself does not receive a severance gift, while a servant sold by the court does receive a severance gift. 13. According to the oral tradition, we learned that a Hebrew maidservant may not have her servitude prolonged by having her ear pierced. This appears to be reflected from the relevant verses. For with regard to the piercing of a servant's ear, Exodus 21:5 states, I love my master, my wife, and my children. What then is implied by Deuteronomy 15:17, even to your maidservant do this? It teaches that just as it is a mitzvah to give a severance gift to a Hebrew servant, so too it is a mitzvah to give a Hebrew maidservant a severance gift. 14. Whoever sends away his servant or maidservant empty-handed transgresses a negative commandment, as Deuteronomy 15:13 states, do not send him away empty-handed. This verse also made provision for this to be remedied with a positive commandment. As Exhibit 14 states, you should certainly give him a severance gift. This applies to a Hebrew servant who is released at the conclusion of his 6 years of servitude, at the advent of the Jubilee, or at the death of his master. Similarly, a severance gift is given to a Hebrew maidservant who is released under these circumstances, or because she displays signs of physical maturity. When, however, a servant or maidservant purchases his freedom by paying the prorated portion of his purchase price, a severance gift need not be given, as implied by Ibid 13. When you send him away from you as a free man, a servant who redeems himself as not being sent away. Instead, he pays the amount of money due for him. He was obligated to work and then departs. Ibid 14 states, give him a generous severance gift from your sheep, your threshing floor, and your vat, as God has blessed you. By mentioning sheep, a threshing floor, and a vat, the verse indicates that the servant must be given objects that will naturally increase and generate blessing as a severance gift. He need not, however, be given money or garments. How much should he be given? He should not be given less than 30 slayim worth. This may be from one substance or from many substances. This figure parallels the 30 slayim paid as a fine for killing a servant, which Exodus 21:32 states, give to his master. Severance gift must be given whether the master's household was blessed because of the servant's presence, whether it was not blessed, as it is written, give him a generous severance gift, i.e., in all situations. Why then does the Torah say, as God has blessed you? To teach that you should give him according to the measure of blessing you have been granted. 15. If the servant fled and the Jubilee fell, and thus he attains his freedom, his master is not obligated to grant him a severance gift, as implied by the term, when you send him away. The severance gift granted a Hebrew servant is his own. A creditor may not expropriate it. The severance gift granted a Hebrew maidservant and any ownerless object she finds belong to her father. If her father dies before it reaches his possession, it belongs to her. Her brothers have no right to it, for a person cannot transfer to his son as inheritance a right that he possesses with regard to his daughter.